Alright, so here we are, the first drive in 2 years. I thought I was checking the timing and everything else. I thought I actually had a coolant leak. It turns out I just revved it up to the point where the air-to-water tank pump kicked in and it sprayed water all over the engine compartment. I feel dumb. But anyway, I've aligned it. Should be pretty close. If anything, it may pull a hair to the left, but we'll find out. I haven't driven this in a long time. I remembered to put the registration sticker on because that's been sitting in the house since February of last year. I don't know how well the audio is going to work on the drive, but let's find out. It's really not that loud, but I do expect there to be some exhaust leaks. See how she does. So far, it's purring like a kitten. Don't know how good the brakes are. They're sinking pretty far to the ground. I need a stronger throttle return spring. I don't like how this feels. Barely touching it. We're still in low gear. Well, it seems to be tracking straight. That's kind of nice. Love the power windows. Oil pressure's good. Coolant's good. Fuel's good. Air fuel's good. Right now I have the data logger set to trigger, I think above 3,500 RPM or something, maybe 4,000.
Let's take a look at the data log of the pull you just saw. This is one of the two big reasons why I took the car for the drive. The other one is to make sure the wheels don't fall off and everything else is great and happy with the car. But I also needed to know where we're going to start before we put the electric Vortec on there and if there's any other issues that need to be worked out. And I happened to find two of them. Now, if you want to see more video of the car just being driven around in traffic, I've got two of those videos and for some reason they're insanely popular. So those are there. Maybe I'll put an info card up there if you want to see them. But that's not the point of this. Again, the point of this was just to make sure that the car is functioning and we can work out any little issues because nothing's worse than going to a dyno and having problems. So again, looking at this data log, if you look at the yellow line is air-fuel ratio. And for the most part, it's pretty decent. You know, right where this sort of cyan line is and where it intersects, it tells you the value up here in the top right-hand corner. So this is 12.8 to 1, which for naturally aspirated wide open throttle is a nice happy place to be. So that's all fine and dandy. AFR is good. Don't really need to worry about it. If you look at the white line is RPM. Now another thing I want to point out are these vertical gray lines right there and right there. Those are represented in this box down here in the right. It gives you the average, the minimum, and the maximum between those 2 points in time. So, and what's really fun about this is you can actually figure out what your acceleration is because you can look at the data log and it gives you a time. Like, for example, the section that I have chosen here is 3.668 seconds. It took to go from this RPM point to 6,173 RPM. That's the maximum that we saw up here, which is up here, and it's also down here. So again, minimum was 3,260, maximum was 6,173 RPM. And, you know, it looked pretty good up here, but down here there was a problem, and you saw that in the pull. In the pull, the car fell on its face. Let's see why that happened. So the green line represents the throttle position. So I was basically cruising, and then when I started giving it gas, I didn't just whack it to the floor, but it was still a pretty quick application to get to wide open throttle. The RPM dropped off like a rock. Well, what else dropped off like a rock? Well, that's the air-fuel ratio. It plummeted. And basically the car choked on fuel. And that's solely because this tune is my Whipple tune, and a Whipple is a positive displacement blower, which means instant boost, which means you need a lot, and I mean a lot of fuel from the accelerator pump to overcome that just amazing burst of air that the Whipple is capable of providing instantaneously. So it was never tuned for naturally aspirated, wide open throttle running. So that's what happened there. So once again, I got on the gas, it went fat, fell on its face, RPM dropped. The reason why you could see these massive drops is because it's power glide, and these drops are actually occurring in the converter. So the engine is actually dropping, but the car, it's not like stomping on the brakes. It's kind of more like driving a car with a CVT and a power glide. It's a little bit different. But anyway, so then I went wide open throttle for a little bit, and then I lifted again when it fell on its face, and everything was fine and hunky-dory, and the air fuel leaned out. But then I applied gas again relatively quickly with at about the same speed as I did the first time around, at least from this point to this point. So from this point to this point represent roughly the same sort of acceleration curve of the throttle pedal. And you see the same thing happening again. You see the air fuel falling like a rock. This time it actually bottoms out. RPM drops, same deal. But eventually it catches up. The engine swallows the fuel and it starts to accelerate. That represents this soft curve right here. And that's also a coupling of the converter too. So there's two things going on there. So I had the gas matted, so that explains the choke that you saw. Not worried about that. Easy to tune out. It's in the accelerator pump function. Not a big deal, but at least we're aware of it now. So again, now that the engine's pulling clean, you can see the throttle just stayed on the floor. And what's really interesting to me is this red line. So this red line represents manifold absolute pressure, or MAP. And it's measured right now in kilopascals. It started out, let's look down here. So it started out at 97.4 between these two gray lines and ended at 94.2. Wait a second. That's bad. And you can see it basically trends straight down. The red line basically trends straight down as RPM rises. That's indicative of a restriction. Now, kilopascals doesn't mean much to most of us. So the question is, how many kilopascals, what does that actually mean? How bad is that? Well, let's just change that red line from kilopascals to boost. And that's something more of us can relate to. So if I change it to boost, okay, and let's look down here, we started out at negative 0.2, and by the time we're down here, there's some ripple in the data, but it's actually a fairly clean trace. You're down to negative 0.7. So that's like having almost half a point of negative boost up here at 6,173 RPM. Now, from previous dyno testing, I happen to know that this combination naturally aspirated peaks right around 6,150. So this is not, some outlier. This is not way out there in the RPM band where you're not going to be racing. No, this is right at the peak. I could have pulled this further through, maybe 6,500, 6,600, but, I got the information I needed. So what we have here is obviously a restriction. And because my intake manifold is based on a TrickFlow Street intake manifold, the manifold itself is not a restriction. And we can determine that because the map is actually taking its information from the manifold's plenum. So the restriction is before the manifold's plenum, which means in this case the throttle body. That's the downside of having done all the work I did to this TrickFlow Street manifold and ported it within an inch of its life and everything else. We cut over 11 pounds of aluminum out of that manifold. It works extremely well. I do think that the elbow that I'm using, it's a Pro-M elbow. I think that thing necks down kind of small and then makes the right-hand turn into the engine. I think that's a bit of a contributing factor here. But now that we're doing the electric Vortec, we kind of have to address this issue because, one thing we do know is that the electric Vortec is going to be power limited. I'm certain of that. And if it's starting half a pound of boost in the hull and we may only make 4, 5, 6, 7 psi. I don't think we're going to make 8. But that's still not bad because it's still going to make it the most powerful electric supercharged car in the world. I'd rather not start down low. I was getting ready to wrap up this video, but then I realized there was a little bit more kung fu with data logs that I could share with you. So I pulled this up and busted out the recorder again. And I did change one thing on this graph. This is right at the top of that pull. And I changed a trace, basically. I turned the green line into, instead of a throttle position, because we know it's wide open throttle up there, I turned the green line into duty cycle. So duty cycle is the percentage of time the injectors are open. If you know that, and you know where your horsepower peak occurs, RPM-wise, you can actually figure out your horsepower, at least pretty darn closely. So this car has 80-pound injectors. If we look at the duty cycle, in this case we're at 6,165 RPM, and I happen to know from previous dyno testing that this thing makes peak horsepower at about 6,150 RPM, so let's call this close enough. We can look at the duty cycle, and the duty cycle here is 36.9%. First we have to figure out our total fuel flow. Our total fuel flow is basically 80-pound injectors, times 8, because there's 8 of them. That gives us 640 pounds of fuel flow if they were open all the time. Now, they're only open 36.9% of the time, so we would multiply it by 0.369, and that gives us 236.16. So we take 236.16 and divide it by what would be a fair brake-specific fuel consumption for this kind of naturally aspirated motor. It's not the greatest one in the world. It's got kind of low compression. It's designed for boost. So let's, a good solid street motor would be around 0.45. A good race motor would be around 0.4, somewhere in there. Compression comes into play, camshaft events, everything else. But a fair guess for a motor like this is about 0.47. So again, we take 236.16 and divide it by 0.47 for our brake-specific fuel consumption, and we end up with 502 horsepower, which is pretty close to about right because I've had this thing on the dyno before and I have an idea of how much power it makes. And I also happen to have a very close idea on how much the torque converter and the power glide costs me. So 502 horsepower is pretty darn close. Hey, for a car that's 8.8 to 1 compression, that really doesn't suck. That's not bad. So that's where our baseline is for the Vortec, and that gives us some great data. So let me get back to the fabulous wrap-up I did the first time. So anyway, so that's where we're at, and it was great having you guys along for this ride. This is now the third video of the LTD just driving around, but this one hopefully had a little bit more information. So, I'm going to put some more footage of the drive because, like I said, for some reason people love to see that. So, that's going to be here at the end of the video. Enjoy the lovely spring, late spring, I guess is where we're at. Enjoy the lovely late spring scenery and the car ride. And, I've got a lot of cool stuff coming up. The ESC for the electric Vortec is here. I've just been geeking out technically because I figured out a really neat trick to control it. I've already plugged it into the computer. I programmed it with USB. I just haven't tested it because I'm waiting for connectors to show up, and they should be here tomorrow. But there's a lot of cool stuff coming up, and this Vortec is literally just around the corner. I have to do very little work to get to the point of assembling it, and then we're going to test it, and that's really what I think everybody is really waiting for. So, enjoy the ride, and don't forget, subscribe. Thanks.
Kind of surprised the cooling fan didn't kick on till 182 that time. Whatever. We're still data logging this whole journey. I had it trigger data logs above, like I said, above 3,000 or 3,500 RPM for the racetrack, so it would start data logging as soon as I start my burnout. And not to shut off until I shut the car off. Well, nothing's on fire. That's a good thing. make sure the power trunk release still works. I know the power windows do. Definitely needs a stronger return spring on the throttle.